This podcast is a production of Widener Law Commonwealth in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. For more information, visit commonwealthlaw.widener.edu/podcast. Keeping up with the latest legal thinking can be challenging. Our educational programs help you stay tuned in to the legal profession. The following is a recording from the 2016 lecture entitled A Conservative Case for Climate Action. Now here's Commonwealth Professor of Law and the Director of the Environmental Law and Sustainability Center, John Dernbach, to introduce the speaker from this event.
Well, good afternoon. My name is John Dernbach. I'm a professor here at Widener University Commonwealth Law School, and I also direct the Environmental Law and Sustainability Center. We're happy to have you here. We live at an enormously significant time. Greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere are higher now than they have been in 800,000 years. The basic physics of climate change, I think, is pretty straightforward. If you put those gases in the atmosphere, you tend to force warming, and you tend to force both the atmosphere and the oceans. And there's abundant evidence that the climate is changing. Where we're going is a little uncertain, but it's pretty clear that that we're going in a place where we have never, ever been before as a civilization. Now, if you look at the way the politics of this issue plays out nationally, and you look at the Republican primary candidates, they all have a particular position on climate change. I think you know what it is. If you look at the Democratic primary candidates for president, they also have a particular position, and they all line up, and they're all pretty uniform on the Republican side, and they're all pretty uniform on the opposite, on the Democratic side. And to some degree, to I think an unfortunate degree, the same people are saying the same things over and over. Now, last December, at a conference at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore on climate change and public health, I heard a fellow named Jerry Taylor speak. Jerry Taylor made a conservative case for action on climate change. And I thought as soon as I heard him that it would be great to get him here. And it's my privilege to say that he is here today to make a conservative case for action on climate change. He's the president of the Niskanen Center. Prior to founding the center in 2014, he spent 23 years at the Cato Institute, where he served as Director of Natural Resources Studies, Assistant Editor of Regulation Magazine, Senior Fellow, and then Vice President. Before that, he was the Staff Director for the Energy and Environment Task Force at an organization called the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. Over the past 2 decades, Mr. Taylor has been one of the most prominent and influential libertarian voices on energy policy in Washington. He's the author of numerous policy studies, has testified often before Congress, and his commentary has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. This is a perspective, I expect, that you may not have heard before, and it's a great privilege for me as a professor at this law school in the capital city of one of the most populous states in the country to be able to present Jerry Taylor. Thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, John. I am used to being in front of audiences like yours and at podiums like this, arguing to the contrary. At 20-odd years at the Cato Institute, I was on TV and radio and in op-ed pages and on Fox News and at the Wall Street Journal, arguing against climate action. I argued that climate change was not as great a problem as had oft been suggested, that the costs of doing something about it were probably greater than the benefits, and that it was simply an engine to expand the size of government, and that even if there's a problem that needs to be addressing, it needs to be addressed at international level, so no domestic conversation really should be going forward. That was the position I had for the better part of 2 decades. But mirabile dictu, I changed my mind. Sometimes that does happen. It didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly. And my talk this afternoon will be largely about the things that changed my mind and why I find myself in a different place on this issue. But the first and most important thing I want to say is that how we feel about the role of government should have nothing to do with how we feel about the reality of atmospheric physics. As a libertarian, as a free market type, I believe that the government's role is to protect the life, liberty, and property of its people. So I am for limited government, and I am for economic liberties. I'm also, as a libertarian, for social liberty as well, and civil liberties. But that doesn't have anything to do with how I read science. And now, of course, we all have our engines of motivated cognition. We'd like the world to look to us in ways that are conducive towards our ends. But the reality is that we need to try mightily to make sure, if anything, modern science has added strength to the straight physics calculations undertaken in 1906 about what happens if we increase greenhouse gas concentrations into the atmosphere. Now, at the Cato Institute, where I used to work, this was not a particularly controversial proposition. If you look at the so-called climate skeptics, the scientists who publish in peer-reviewed journals, who are not as alarmed about climate change as our most mainstream scientists, and by that I mean my former colleagues Pat Michaels at Cato, Dick Lindzen, Emeritus Professor of Atmospheric Physics at MIT, John Christie at the University of Alabama, Bob Balling at Arizona State University, Judith Curry at the University of Georgia Tech, Willie Soon, and other climate skeptics that get a lot of press. They all accept what I just said. They all accept climate change is happening. They all accept industrial emissions are a major cause of that change. They all believe that warming will continue in the future. They just don't believe it will be as great a warming as some other scientists suggest. But they don't ignore the underlying reality of the problem. The same thing goes for the scientists who go to the Heartland Institute. You may have heard of them. They are probably the major organization promoting skepticism about climate science. I know a little bit about Heartland because my brother runs the climate program over there. I got him his job, by the way, something I'm not entirely wild about looking back on it. But even 80% of the scientists at their latest annual meeting acknowledged what I just said as well. And these are from the climate skeptics. So my point here is that the conservative street is at odds with its own scientific authorities. The scientists that testify for Republicans in the House and the Senate making the argument against alarmism about climate do not reflect the narratives you hear from Senator James Inhofe and a lot of the presidential candidates today, which is that, if I can paraphrase, climate change is either a statistical anomaly, it doesn't exist, it's driven by the sun, or it's all a leftist plot to gut capitalism. That's not what the scientific authorities, even on that side of the fence, would argue when they're under oath testifying in front of Congress. But that climate change poses risks of catastrophe is not an issue either. We are on the business as usual scenario that we're on at present, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, will lead to a 3.6 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit warming by the end of this century at 700 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's if we continue on our current path. That's the likely outcome. That doesn't mean that's the only outcome. That's about a 66% chance of occurring. According to Harvard economist Martin Weitzman, that means, if the IPCC is correct, there's even a 10% chance that warming after this century will exceed 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Skeptics say it's somewhat lower. Other alarmists say it's even higher than that. Now, this is so speculative. The reason that, even the likely scenario is a huge range, right? 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit versus 11 degrees Fahrenheit, that's the range of the likely outcome. And then there's a chance that it might be higher or even lower than that. So there is a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty about this because we have never before seen such high atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. Never before in all of human history. We have literally no data points to go on. But we have seen these kinds of high concentrations in the atmosphere long, long ago in the past before the rise of Homo sapiens. The most recent was in the Pliocene epoch some 3 million years ago. Then when we saw greenhouse gas concentrations at the levels we are seeing today, temperatures were 2 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than they are today, and sea levels were 33 to 131 feet greater than they are today. So this, in my opinion, is really a risk management challenge. Each side uses uncertainty to justify its positions. Conservatives say, my God, the estimates of warming are so disparate and there's so many error bars on the high side and the low side that we can't say anything with confidence. You're asking us to remake the economy in an expensive fashion to address a very speculative problem. And, of course, environmentalists say the precautionary principle demands that we address potential risks in the future as well. Each side uses uncertainty to justify their position for action or lack of action. And the reality is risk preferences are subjective. There is no objectively correct way to address risk or to establish the willingness to pay to reduce risk. So this gets us in kind of a quandary. But I find it interesting that when we look at risks like this in other contexts, we play a game of musical chairs. Let me give you a very good example of this. Right after 9/11, you might remember there was a brief bit of concern about nuclear weapons in Pakistan and whether those nuclear weapons were finding their way or whether that nuclear technology was finding its way. There was a full distributional range of possible outcomes, and they all have to be considered when we think about our response. So, for instance, what was the most, just think about it in this way. Last year, at the beginning of the baseball season, what was the most likely outcome? Well, according to Las Vegas and the bookies there, the most likely outcome were the Washington Nationals are going to win the World Series going away. They didn't even make the playoffs, but that was the most likely outcome. What's the most likely outcome in financial markets in any given year? Well, equities will return better than anything else. Do we invest that way? Do we put all of our money in equities? No, because there's a wide range of possible outcomes and we hedge. We may not know what the risks are in the economy. We may not be able to quantify them precisely, but we account for them and we hedge for them. Catastrophic warming is a non-diversifiable risk. It means that there's nothing we can invest in that will pay off if catastrophic climate changes occur. So how do we think about catastrophic and how do we think about non-diversifiable risks that are of a significant nature in financial markets? Well, the best place we can find that is in the spread between the returns on equities and bonds, right? We pay good money in financial markets to hedge against non-diversifiable risk. In other words, when we're looking at the very same risk problems we're looking at in climate change in other contexts, we pay good money to avoid them. When we're not covered by ideology, we hedge against these non-diversifiable risks. So, revealed preferences suggest that public policy that best comports with private preferences and climate risk avoids finding ourselves in La Brea tar pit where ideology dictates response. So this is one of the main reasons that I shifted on my position on climate change, because both sides acknowledge there's uncertainty, both sides acknowledge there's risk. They have a hot debate about the most likely outcome, very little debate about the full range of the possible distribution of outcomes. And if we account for those things, which we account for in every other context, I think it makes a very strong argument for climate action. Now, libertarians in particular have very good reasons to pay particular attention to climate change, which might surprise you because most libertarians and hardline conservatives instinctively obviously feel to the contrary. But as a libertarian, I believe that protecting private property is one of the core functions of government. We set up a government to protect the rights of life, liberty, and property to its people. And if you get a libertarian in a room and give him sodium pentothal, he'll tell you that's all government ought to do. But it is a vital and important role. If the threat to life, liberty, and property is coming from greenhouse gas emissions, how is that any different than if the threat to life, liberty, and property is coming from terrorism or from other threat? Named Jonathan Adler, who now teaches at Case Western Law School. But I knew him in Washington when he was a policy think tanker just like I was. And he wrote a paper a few years ago in which he reminded libertarians that cost-benefit analysis should have nothing to do with this conversation, at least from a libertarian standpoint. So, for instance, cost-benefit calculations implicitly maintain that if Party A destroys the property of Party B, but A gains more than B loses, fine. What libertarian would ever say that? That you get to destroy my property because in the course of doing so, you gain more than I lost. That's not a proper respect for property rights or liberties, is it? But libertarians forward that argument again and again and again, and they would never forward that argument in any other context, or they'd at least be very embarrassed to do so. The final thing which knocked me off my old perch of opposition is that it's not a choice between whether to act or not act against climate change. As I've told you, I believe the narratives from the IPCC are correct. I believe mainstream scientific assessments of risk. So I don't need convincing on that point. But even if you don't agree with me, the decision is not whether to act or not act. The decision now we must make is how to act. The main reason for that is that regulation is now the baseline scenario. There was a Supreme Court decision a few years ago under Massachusetts versus EPA, which found that the Clean Air Act does indeed require the government to act to address greenhouse gas emissions if the agency finds the greenhouse gas emissions are a risk to human life or environmental quality. And the EPA found exactly that. So they are required to act. So the baseline is regulation. If we do nothing, we will address greenhouse gas emissions via regulation through the Environmental Protection Agency and through other vehicles at the state and local level. So this is the underlying reality. We have a mix of very costly, very inefficient, and very clunky environmental controls. Some of them are via command and control regulation. Some are through tax credits and subsidies for various clean energy sources. Some are just naked production mandates for clean energy regardless of costs. This is not the best way to go about this business. What I argue at the Niskanen Center is that we should replace all of these vehicles of addressing greenhouse gas emissions with a straight, clean carbon tax. Put a price on carbon that reflects the costs of the risks that we are imposing on the rest of society, and then leave it to market actors to decide when, where, and how to reduce those emissions. I mean, would you rather leave that to market actors, or would you rather have the government telling us when, where, and how to reduce emissions? If you go that route, what you're going to find is that those decisions will become hotly political. Right? So, for instance, we subsidize ethanol in this country, and we mandate its consumption, ostensibly to protect the environment and to reduce greenhouse gases, even though virtually every environmental organization in Washington today considers that to be an absolute fraud, that it is actually a net contributor to greenhouse gases, it is not environmentally friendly, even when it comes to conventional pollutants. But we have the program because a plausible story can be told that it is a clean. And we can also be sure that the lowest cost means of avoiding that tax are the ones that industry will pursue, which means we will get greenhouse gas emissions reductions at the lowest possible cost. Now, hopefully, you've all heard my little talk here for a few minutes, and you think this is incredibly sound and wise and persuasive, and then wonder why it is that it has absolutely no political power in Washington, D.C. Well, actually, I think it does. But the main roadblock, the main political challenge is in the Republican Party. Most Democrats and environmentalists I talk to have no problem accepting this narrative. For instance, even in 2009, when Barack Obama forwarded a national cap and trade legislation, the Waxman-Markey bill, he preferred to have a national price on carbon rather than have EPA regulate, because he understood the inefficiencies associated with government regulation, even the alleged socialist Barack Obama. He preferred a market price for carbon, to leave it to market actors. He proposed to deliver that market price through a cap and trade regime, which is a little bit different from what I'm talking about, but not radically so. But Republicans in Congress said no. And so when Republicans in Congress said no, he followed up on his threat. He said, if you're not going to address this in a sensible fashion, I wish you would. But if you do not pass legislation, I will use the authority I already have in the EPA to go forward and do it. We know that Democrats and environmentalists would prefer a price on carbon. And having talked with a number of legislators on both sides of the aisle in the Democratic Party and environmental leaders, I know that they're interested in this conversation. But Republicans are not. I maintain the Republican that is the anomaly. So this is important, of course, because in most Republican districts, they don't worry about challenges from Democrats in general elections. They worry about Tea Party challenges on the right. And it's the fear that by talking about climate change in an adult fashion in the manner in which I've talked about it, might risk their political careers. In 2008, for instance, Congressman Robert Inglis from South Carolina forwarded a carbon tax bill, a Republican bill, and he lost a seat over it, or at least to that and other reasons, as part of a Tea Party challenge. So for a lot of Republicans in the House, they don't want to be Bob Inglis. Now, Bob Inglis is a nice guy. I know him, and he is still involved in the climate discussion. But nobody wants to be unemployed over this issue. So one of the roadblocks we have is that the Republican Party feels that they can't cross the Tea Party in a majority of the Republican districts. So the Republicans in the Congress won't act. Now, I'm not entirely sure that problem will last forever, simply because Tea Party strength, I think, is waning greatly in American politics. But we'll see how that plays out. But that's the first obstacle to seeing this kind of idea get traction politically. But before we go too far on that ground, I think libertarians and Tea Party voters are very easy to understand. And I used to be rather copacetic with their ideas and beliefs, so I think I know a little bit of what I speak. The problem we face here is that Tea Parties, libertarians, and conservatives don't like the message their own lives to run as they wish. But the central organizing principle of government, according to the Founding Fathers, is to protect the right to life, liberty, and property. And we're going to now throw that out and join an environmental cult? Well, that's what I used to argue from podiums like this, and this is the way the Tea Party thinks, and I certainly understand it. Environmentalists have asked for a lot of their own trouble. Naomi Klein has a best-selling book today. If you go to Amazon.com, you'll find a book called This Changes Everything, which Naomi Klein says climate change is the final and absolute answer for why capitalism has to go. And a lot of environmentalists carry that book around at rallies and meetings and whatnot. Bernie Sanders confabs probably have a lot of Naomi Klein floating around. And so when conservatives hear that, they say, really, you're going to make me choose between capitalism and addressing a risk which may or may not prove significant decades hence? I'll choose capitalism. And finally, conservatives and libertarians are put off by the romanticization that we sometimes hear about deindustrialization. You hear a lot from Al Gore and other environmentalists about how we're too materialistic. We need to get in touch with our spiritual side. Growth and wealth creation isn't everything. Let's get in touch with the world around us and the natural world. And it sounds to a lot of conservatives and libertarians like what Al Gore really wants to do is grow a long beard and move into Lancaster and join the Amish and take all of us along for the ride, whether we like it or not. That doesn't resonate very well either. In short, conservatives and libertarians and Tea Party members fear the risks of unleashing government and environmentalists in charge of government to address greenhouse gas emissions a lot more than they fear the risks associated with climate change. That is the problem. Not the logic of acting to address risks. Not the logic of why carbon taxation is a far better way of going about this business than unleashing bureaucrats and tens and thousands of pages of regulation. It's a fear of the implications of even having this conversation in the first place. Now, all of those fears are not imaginary, but the reality is, as I'm sure is true with a lot of people in this room, either you're environmentalists, you know people who are green, you probably don't know of, but he's extremely important to a lot of libertarians. His name is Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard is probably the highest of all high priests when it comes to individual liberty and rights in opposition to government power. And in the 1960s, Murray Rothbard found himself in the middle of a not too entirely dissimilar debate. It was about air pollution. And back in the 1960s, there was a controversy about whether urban air pollution had any ill health effects or not. Prior to that, we didn't take them very seriously. But in the 1960s, we began to take them seriously. And there was a part of the conservative world that still exists to some extent, but was much more vocal then, that argued everything we were hearing about smog and urban ozone and conventional pollution was a load of nonsense, that it had no ill health effects at all. It was ginned up. It was a bunch of bad science being marshaled by pro-government types who wanted to gut capitalism. So what Murray Rothbard, probably the highest of all high priests when it came to the idea that the government should leave us alone to live our own lives as we wish, he had this to say to conservatives who made that argument. He says, conservatives deny that the problem exists, speaking of air pollution, and attribute, quote, the entire agitation to leftists who want to destroy capitalism and technology on behalf of a tribal form of socialism. While part of this charge may be correct, denial of the very existence of the problem is to deny science itself and to give a vital hostage to the leftist charge that defenders of capitalism place property rights above human rights. Moreover, defense of air pollution does not even defend property rights. On the contrary, it puts these conservatives' stamp of approval on those industrialists who are trampling upon the property rights of the mass of the citizenry. There once was a time when liberty-minded people were not so willing to give a pass to violations of liberty as long as they were undertaken by major industrialists or major corporations or major business entities that they felt friendly and kind towards. My hope is that the libertarian world will come back to that day in the not too terribly distant future, and so will conservatives. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and I'd like to open it up now for questions and conversation. I think that'd be a better use of our time.
I gather some 3x5 cards were circulated around. Do you all have those? Okay, so if you've got those questions, hand them to the students, and we'll pass them to the front here.
Nor necessarily should it be the way this plays out. My political hat, once I put that on, will tell you that there will indeed be a great deal of compensation and help to these industries. Right now, for the coal sector, for instance, It's very easy to imagine a world in which we address climate change more aggressively, but make sure that coal miners are compensated and given stipends. Heck, there's not enough coal miners left in this country to seriously put a dent on the budget. A carbon tax of the sort that is being talked about in Washington would probably produce about $150 billion worth of revenue. The entire coal industry combined, if you look at its market cap, is probably no more than $10 billion. You can buy them out several times over and still have a lot of money to play with. You can make each coal miner a millionaire and still have a lot of money to play with. So there's a lot of ways to compensate the coal sector to make sure that people are made whole and are not forced to suffer in the course of this energy transition. When it comes to the oil and gas sector, I'm not entirely sure that's in the cards. They have a great deal of forewarning where policy is heading here. It's not as if anything is going to catch them by surprise. And in fact, to be fair to them, if you look at the websites of ExxonMobil and BP, used to be British Petroleum, Chevron and others, you'll find that they support putting a price on carbon. They think that is a better policy than the regulations. They are already, in theory at least, fully supportive of going exactly down the road that I suggest. They're not working very hard to get there for lots of complicated political reasons and probably some corporate reasons as well. But the reality is, in the oil and gas sector, they have plenty of time to adjust to a transition. It will be decades before cars are, for the most part, being powered by something other than fossil fuels. So they have a time to transition. And you see that industry is already doing that to some extent. BP and other companies are investing heavily in clean energy and other energy sources. So I'd rather leave that to their own corporate actors and not worry a great deal about compensating them in the course of this energy transition. When it comes to the coal sector, given the fact that they are facing a death spiral even as we speak, that they will almost certainly get compensation and help in the course of legislation. Though I can't tell you there's a great deal of intellectual justification for it.
Okay, the next question here is, do you speak to Republicans in Congress? And if so, what is the response?
I do. The Niskanen Center, which I founded when I left the Cato Institute a year and a half ago, and just by the way, the Niskanen Center is about more than climate policy and carbon taxes. While that is part of our agenda, we also address the amount of our time talking to senior Republicans, senior elected officials, as well as senior Republican staff in the House and the Senate. What I find is that what they say behind closed doors is not quite what they say in public. Behind closed doors, Republicans understand full well what I've just said. Most Republicans are not complete denialists about the science. Most Republicans understand that raw political force cannot unwind the regulations that they don't like and that a deal needs to be made somehow to put them in a better place and to reduce costs. And most Republicans don't believe that this equilibrium is sustainable forever with their climate denialism in American politics, that cannot last to their benefit for very long. And they do think that there's room for better policy here. So when I talk to Republicans, I talk generally to a receptive audience. The difficulty they have is getting from here to there. They're not entirely sure how to move from where they are to where they want to be, which is somewhere close to what I've just suggested. Some of it is fear of the Tea Party and the Republican electoral base. Some of it is concern that industry is only half-hearted in all of this. If industry would rally around this cause and make their jobs easier, industry says, well, Republicans aren't leading, so why should we do anything? Why should we go out there and try to gin up the Republican Party to do something they show no interest in doing anyway? We only have so much political capital. So there's a first mover problem. And they don't trust Democrats. Republicans believe that the ideas that we forward probably would improve policy. It'd be cheaper to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by harnessing markets than by harnessing regulations. It's not that heavy a lift to tell Republicans that. But they don't believe the Democrats will entertain the idea or that environmentalists will because they're married to big government, married to regulations, married to the Environmental Protection Agency. I don't believe those perceptions are correct, but the reality is there's so much distrust in Washington. There's so little conversation going on across the aisle that there's a lot of trust building that needs to occur before Republicans will feel confident jumping on this front. But these are behind-the-scenes conversations. They're not what you hear when these very same legislators talk in public about climate change. I think that tells you that the tectonic plates underneath the GOP are not particularly stable. Remember, it was as recently as 2008 that the Republican Party nominated for president a candidate who would have been arguably more aggressive than Barack Obama on addressing climate change, and that was John McCain. That wasn't all that long ago. And today, if you watch Donald Trump on television and read about him in the newspapers, you probably have noticed already that he has no difficulty in moving the Republican electorate from one position to another simply because he says it's a good idea. The fact is, in American politics, people are tribal. They follow the leader. They don't dictate to the leader. If Barack Obama says, if Donald Trump says Planned Parenthood is okay, a lot of Republicans say, yeah, that sounds good to us. If Donald Trump says that single-payer health care is a lot better than what we've got, polls show that a lot of Republicans agree, even after. Well, the question of energy subsidies is somewhat of a complicated one. Economic shock. In the fossil fuel sector, we hear a lot about subsidies to the oil and gas companies. I'm here to tell you they're not that important. The major oil and gas companies will be happy to live without them. Why? Because they don't really affect them. So we have an accelerated depreciation allowance, for instance, in the oil sector. But BP doesn't get to claim it, or does ExxonMobil. It goes to vertically de-integrated small producers, which ain't them. In other words, these are the equivalent of mom-and-pop drilling operations in Texas and Oklahoma. So the oil industry writ large, big oil as it were, gains nothing with that. It turns out most of the oil and gas subsidies are somewhat like that. The oil and gas sector pays a pretty high tax rate, and the tax breaks they do get do not reduce that rate very much. So they're not particularly interested in these subsidies. They're more than happy to let them go as long as they're part of a deal. The nuclear power industry gets a tremendous amount of subsidy and arguably wouldn't exist without them. But on the other hand, c'est la vie is my opinion on that one. So, for instance, nuclear power is not particularly competitive right now on a cost basis, which is why nobody tries to build nuclear power plants. But if they ever were to re-engage in the business of building nuclear power plants, what most people don't know is that we have a law in the books that Barack Obama himself voted for, so this wasn't a Republican scheme, that would guarantee 90% of the investment dollars utilities make in the course of building nuclear power plants. So if they tried to build another Shoreham or another nuclear power plant and then had to pull the plug on that plant because the cost overruns or what have you, 90% of the money spent to build that plant would be picked up by the U.S. taxpayer. A nuclear power plant can cost $6 billion to build. So when we hear about lost loan guarantees to companies like Solyndra, like a lot of conservatives, I shake my fist. I don't believe we should be in the business of providing loan guarantees. But the loan guarantees that are at risk if we ever try to rebuild nuclear power under current law could be staggeringly much larger than Solyndra. So should we let that go? I say yes. An end to corporate welfare. When it comes to green energy subsidies, the green energy lobbies that I talk to in Washington are more than happy to make this trade. If you put a price on carbon that reasonably reflects the risks that are being imposed by greenhouse gas emissions, you do more to help the competitive position of clean energy companies than you do with this piecemeal world of tax credits and preferences, which can be yanked out from under them by the Congress at almost any given time. And they're happy for the trade. Now, of course, the devil's in the details. Depends how high the tax is, so you can't really know in advance that it's a done deal. But the reality is that when we have these conversations with environmentalists and clean energy folks, they have no problem talking about eliminating their side of the subsidies. So I don't believe that subsidies, whether we're talking about brown energy subsidies, green energy subsidies, or whatnot, are that central to the energy economy. It's not going to cause a price collapse. But a lot of companies which have been, building business plans around them will have to rethink matters a bit. But anyway, the bottom line is, to the extent to which we had been previously using the tax code to provide for preferences to clean energy, those same sort of incentives will be better delivered by a naked carbon tax. But it will be done fairly without the government picking winners and losers.
Okay, well, on the same theme, if politics is ideally a game of compromise, what quote-unquote tribal orthodoxy is the left willing to give up in exchange for getting conservatives to embrace climate change solutions?
Well, we're going to find out, hopefully, if we do our job well. But I will suggest to you that if the price that we impose on carbon is robust enough, let's say $40 a ton, I think it could legitimately be far higher, but politically I can't imagine a price starting out at higher than 40. I think that environmentalists and Democrats would give up a lot for that price. I know this because, while having talked to them, and they're not in front of cameras, they have no reason to particularly lie to me, they have nodded approval to the elimination of the Clean Power Plan, to the potential elimination of all of the green energy and clean energy subsidies, to the production orders, to even conventional environmental standards like the mercury and air toxic standard and the new national ambient air quality standards for urban ozone, which have price tags, each of which are higher than the Clean Power Plan. But the conventional emissions reductions that would follow from a robust carbon tax are greater than the conventional emissions reductions that follow from those laws. So they trade those off as well. The main reason environmentalists are willing to have this conversation isn't because they read
disruptive preventative measures or something like that, unquote, such as hurricane-proof housing.
Yeah, it's possible, but insurance practices are heavily regulated at the state level, and so what the insurance industry may wish to do may have absolutely nothing with what they're allowed to do. So given how regulated this sector of the economy is, this is probably more of a political matter than it is anything else. But I want to say something about the insurance industry since the topic came up. If you were to get a bunch of intellectual libertarians and hardline conservatives in a room and you said, all right, what's the ideal way of addressing with environmental problems? Is there a way to do it without government? They'll say, yeah, we shouldn't even have environmental laws and regulations. We should have property rights. Let people have property rights to the air and the water and the land, the air over their house or what have you. And if people pollute, and it's like dumping in your backyard, you take them to court for a nuisance or trespass violation. That's how you deal with it. Now, of course, a lot of economists will spend a lot of time telling you how that's excessively costly. It's very hard to enforce, trace emissions back to the original source. It's impractical. There'll be a lot of legal costs. You're going to turn class action suits into a nightmare, all of which are true, which is why it's not my position. But a lot of libertarians believe that is the ideal scenario. And then if you press them and say, well, then how is this really going to play out? And they say, oh, it wouldn't be that hard. You would have regulations, all right. They'd just be private regulations dictated by the insurance industry. Let's assume we had a rule that said industrial polluters had to have insurance to protect themselves against lawsuits for the consequences of their pollution, right? They have insurance coverage in case you get sued by Greenpeace. Well, the insurance industry will insure your emissions, they'll insure your operations, but they'll impose conditions just like they do on anything else. And it may very well be that you will not get insurance coverage, which you need to go forward and engage in business, unless you meet the standards dictated by the insurance company when it comes to your policy, which might very well lead to a lot of aggressive reductions, much of which may be like the EPA is looking at. Now, this is how things spin out in theoretical libertarian land where I come from. I don't think that it's not to tell you to go read these tracts, which aren't going to be particularly relevant. But what I find tremendously interesting is that while libertarians and free market types talk about how the insurance industry would have all of the right incentives to sensibly regulate the environmental impacts of regulation, because they're the ones who would ultimately be responsible in the course of being sued over those emissions. That today, that's to some extent true. And it's the insurance industry that is one of the most vocal proponents of doing something about climate change. If you were to look in the American industrial spectrum and find out which actors are most involved in trying to reduce emissions, it's the insurance industry. That ought to tell conservatives and libertarians something very important.
Hey, next question. And you alluded to this a little bit. Why do you prefer a carbon tax over a cap-and-trade system? And do you think a carbon tax is an easier sell to politicians and the public?
Oh, well, we've been trying to sell cap-and-trade, and it failed spectacularly in 2009. So it's faced a political test and didn't pass. But we do have cap-and-trade at the state level, which is somewhat more successful. So we can't be too dispositive in our judgments. Really, they're not that different. A tax gives us certainty about how much we're going to spend on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and leaves uncertain the emissions reductions that then follow. So price is certain. Quantity is going to vary. The market will decide quantity. That's what happens in a carbon tax. In a cap-and-trade world, it is the quantity that is certain. We dictate how much emissions are going to occur, and then we let price be uncertain. Right? The market will decide what the price is for those emissions. Which should we prefer? I don't know. There's no clear and best answer here. It really amounts to whether you want to buy an insurance policy in which the price of the policy is fixed and understandable and known in advance, or whether you'd like to buy an insurance policy in which the price is not fixed and known in advance, but it maybe has a better chance of hedging because we can at least guarantee that the emissions will be X. They're not going to vary. So now a lot of environmentalists like cap and trade because they're more concerned about the level of emissions. They want certainty there. They want to make sure we hit targets. And then whatever the price is, the price is. I understand that completely. It's very defensive. And a lot of conservatives would say, well, we want the carbon tax because the price is very certain. That we want to know what we're paying for. You can make that argument too. But you can write a carbon tax that allows for varying tax rates depending upon emissions, as do left of center economists, by the way. It has all the right optics, and it allows them, by the way, to use that revenue to cut other taxes or provide rebates to the American people so they can say, we're not just socking it to Joe Sixpack. We're going to send all the money we collect from the tax back to Joe Sixpack. All right? So we make them whole. That's an easier sell for Republicans. I'll grant you can do the same thing with a cap and trade program. But cap and trade tends to be more complicated. People don't quite understand it very well. Carbon tax is more understandable. It also makes it more dangerous because a cap and trade really is a tax. It's just a question of how high the tax is unclear. But a carbon tax is straight up a tax. No way to pretend it isn't. Republicans don't believe they're put on this earth to promote taxes. So it's not obvious which is the best approach, but for the time being, we think the carbon tax is the more fertile way to go.
You have other cards. Raise your hand or something, and somebody will pick them up. But in the meantime, the one in front of me asks, would you consider the right wing of the Republican Party the new mainstream of the party regarding climate change? If so, is this driven by the conservative media protecting big business?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I don't think I got it.
Okay. Would you consider the right wing of the Republican Party the new mainstream of the party regarding climate change? If so, is this driven by the conservative media protecting big business?
Here you go. You know, I think that the power of the conservative media is overstated. And if you ever needed examples of that, you can watch the rise of Donald Trump, which is not necessarily occurring with the grand support of the conservative media establishment. The Wall Street Journal hates the man. They are very important in conservative circles. Doesn't matter. You all know about the conflicts between Donald Trump and Fox News, at least episodic conflicts. Doesn't seem to have any impact on Donald Trump. I'm not sure the conservative media is all that influential. I'm not entirely sure the corporate community is all that influential either. A large number of the corporate community backed the Waxman market cap and trade bill. It really didn't matter. If the Republicans were just taking their marching orders from corporate interests, you wouldn't have expected so much opposition from the right when a lot of industry and utilities were willing to sign on. Or another example, which is a little bit more primal, but not directly related to climate, but is also very suggestive. The Tea Party movement, at least the organized Tea Party movement, the ones with full-time employees and headquarters and officers and people who work semi-professionally in the Tea Party movement, is very heavily supported by Koch Industries. A lot of the brains and the manpower and the money, you would not see them flocking to Donald Trump. So I think that a lot of people outside of my world grossly misunderstand the dynamics here. Ideology plays more of a role, and tribal identities play an even larger role than that. It's not so much media or corporations or anything of the kind.
A couple more questions, I think, before we wrap up. How do you address situations such as renters where the party paying the electric bill is not the party with the ability to install energy efficiency measures? Often, low-income renters lack market power to go elsewhere.
Well, if renters are concerned about power bills, then you would think they'd have an incentive to rent properties where energy efficiency is part of the bargain. In other words, we hear a lot about these principal agent problems in rental businesses. I think what it tells you more directly is that most people who rent properties don't particularly care about energy efficiency. If they did, they would demand more energy efficient apartments, and people who provide these apartments and properties would provide that energy efficiency. Right? If there's a demand for something, there'll be a supply. People will supply it. So I'm not particularly convinced that this is a justification for government intervention. Now, a lot of people like John probably disagree with me on this. But even if I'm wrong, The amount of energy in play from the inefficient investments in rental properties is relatively modest. It's not that big a deal. It's not a significant driver for why we emit what we emit when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. And you can't generalize from that observation for a case for government intervention in energy efficiency hither and yon by offering that as an anecdote.
At least one last question here, and this goes back, I guess, a little bit to the science. If the Earth cooled 800,000 years ago, can it do it again?
Sure. It absolutely can. And in fact, one of the things that my brother at the Heartland Institute says as well, long ago they talked about global cooling and the new ice age, and then that disappeared. And so now they're talking about global warming, and we might have another ice age coming. We're overdue anyway. To me, this is ridiculously glib. One of the things that strikes me about climate change, and one of the stories I used to tell was, this isn't all that different. We've had scare stories about population explosions, resource depletion. All sorts of environmentalist hobgoblins have been offered that never played out. How is this any different? Well, the reason they didn't play out is because the data accumulated and science improved, and we found out that population explosion wasn't the problem we thought it was going to be in the 1960s. And we didn't run out of natural resources like we feared in the 1970s. In other words, the fear came and it went because it was self-correcting with new data, new information. It's not that way with climate. Every year, the narrative about climate change being serious strengthens, gets stronger. For 30-odd years now, we have been seriously interested and concerned about climate change, and the evidence for it continues to build. It's not degrading.
Widener University Commonwealth Law School is the Pennsylvania capital's only law school, with 3 specialized centers of legal scholarship through its Law and Government Institute, Environmental Law and Sustainability Center, and Business Advising Program. Widener Law Commonwealth offers an exceptional learning experience that is personal, practical, and professional. Visit commonwealthlaw.widener.edu for more information.